Let's take a look at our first programming assignment that deals with writing our own function. Today's lab is Lab 35 Goodbye Function, and in the programming template window, I've given you a fully functional program. Now this program reads in a name, and the name that we use as our example name is shown here in figure 1, so I put my name in there. And then it produces the output shown in figure 2. So this is the output that the programming code that I've given you produces. Let's go ahead and start out by looking at that program. In your template window, if I run this program that you have with Mrs. Nehus typed in as input, I should get the output that I described in the assignment instructions. So it says, hello Mrs. Nehus from main, this is the output, hello from the function display message, back in function main again. So let's go through the actual program and try to understand what or how the program's producing that output. All right, remember that a C++ program starts its processing with the main function. So even though we have this display message function defined before it, the processing still starts in the main method. So the first thing that happens in the main method is that a variable input name is defined as type string. Now remember, to have a string variable, you have to include string. So we've done that at the top. And then a review of getLine. Remember, getLine will read from the CN object that you see as the first argument, reading it into a variable input name. Now getLine will read embedded white space characters. So in my sample input where I typed in Mrs. Nehus, notice I have that white space between the period and the end, the space character. If we were to just try to use CN, it wouldn't work because it would stop when it hit that white space. So we have to use getLine. getLine will read everything up until it hits the new line character. So Mrs. space Nehus is stored in input name. Now in line 28, we output hello and then the input name variable's contents. Input name has in it Mrs. Nehus. So we're going to output hello Mrs. Nehus from main, and then we call display message. So when we call display message, control transfers up to the display message function. Here's our function. That's the header of the function, display message. When we open the curly brace, open close curly brace, this blocks the code. We execute line 17 here that outputs hello from the function display message. Let's look at the output, the sample output. This was the first output from the main, and then we output hello from the function display message. When we hit the close curly brace, control transfers back to the main method and starts executing the code that follows the function call. Here's our function call. Here is the code that follows it. So we're going to output back in function main again, and then we return 0. So that is how the sample output is produced. Now what we're going to be doing next is modifying this program that you see in our template window so that it will not only output what is included, but we're going to add a little more functionality. This figure 3 shows what needs to be output. This is what is different from the output that you see in the figure 2. So what I need you to do is follow these steps in bullets 1 and 2 to modify not only the main method, but also to add a new function called goodbye message. Now let's look at the modified main method. So if you compare this main method to what you see in the template window, the only thing different is that there is a function call after display message. So you're going to add to your method, your main method, this function called goodbye message input name. So I'm going to go ahead and add that function call here. And it's goodbye message. And then there's open, close, paren. Now, before I move on, I need to look back up and see what is inside those parentheses because they are not empty. We are calling goodbye message with input name. We are going to be passing into our goodbye message function that we are about to define the contents of what is in input name. Well, the contents of input name is the value that was read in. In my sample data, it's Mrs. Nehus. So we're going to add input name inside these parentheses so that we can pass that value into our goodbye message function that we're about to write. All right, in bullet 1 it says add another function after the main that is called goodbye message. Notice it says after the main. This is important because you're going to learn how to write something called a prototype. All right, this function should be defined with a parameter called name of type string. This parameter is needed so that we can pass into it the value input name, the value that input name holds. So we're going to write this function below main, and then its only purpose is to output goodbye, and in our sample it's Mrs. Nehus, but it's not always going to output Mrs. Nehus. That's only if the data that is read in is Mrs. Nehus. So we're going to write a statement to output goodbye, and instead of Mrs. Nehus' literal value, it needs to be outputting name. So what should be the return type of this function? Okay, so this function doesn't actually return anything to the calling program. It just does something. It just outputs goodbye and then name. So the return type needs to be void. Remember, return type is void if it just does something. And then if it actually needs to return a value to the calling function, then it does have a return in it. All right, do you need to add a prototype for this function? Well, the answer is yes, because I've told you to define your main function, define your goodbye message function after main. So yeah, we need a prototype for this. And then bullet 2 says to call this function main right after display message. Do not add any other code to your main function. After your addition, the main function should appear as follows. So we've already done bullet 2. We've added the call to goodbye message. Now we need to actually write goodbye message after the function main. So this is where we're going to define our goodbye message. So I'm going to actually just copy and paste this down here, and you will see it says definition of function, and I'm going to change this to goodbye message. And it still does the same thing. It displays a greeting. So we're going to leave that as is. That's our comments, and then we're going to start our function definition. So goodbye message needs to be defined it has to look exactly like this so that when we call the function, it will know, just like when you define a variable, they have to match exactly. Well, same thing here. When you define a function, the function call has to match exactly the function definition. So here we're going to create our function header, and it is a void return type. Remember, we discussed this already. It's because this function doesn't return anything, it just does something. And then the name here has to match the name in the function call. Now, if you go back to that bullet 1 and look, it says that it needs a parameter of type string called name. So your data type comes first, and then your parameter name, followed by a close parenthesis. Remember, if you don't have a parameter list, then you still need your open close parentheses, just like in display message. All right, we do not put a semicolon at the end, but we do block our code just like we have for any other code block. So we have braces here, we have braces here to block our functions. So this is the beginning of the function, this is the end of the function. What is inside of those braces is the code, the body of the function. So remember, this function is supposed to output goodbye, and then I said use Mrs. Nehus as an example, but it's really going to be outputting whatever was read into input name. Now inside this function, you cannot use input name. Input name is local to the main method, But what you need to realize is when you call goodbye message with input name, it passes the value that input name holds into the parameter string name. So name here will get initialized with whatever input name has in it. You're going to be passing input name into name. So if input name has in it Mrs. Nehus, then when we call goodbye message with input name, we're passing Mrs. Nehus into name. So if I output name, then I will be outputting Mrs. Nehus. Now, if you want to go back and look, we're supposed to write a program that will output goodbye, comma, space, then the name, and then an exclamation point. So let's go do that. We're going to output goodbye, comma, space, and I got to look if the B is capitalized or not. Nope, it's just goodbye, comma, space, and then we need to close our string literal, and then here is where we use our parameter name. And the parameter is called name. So we're going to output name, and then remember there was an exclamation point at the end. And then let's go ahead and give ourselves an indel and a semicolon. That is all this goodbye message needs to do. So when we call goodbye message with input name, it passes input name into name, and then it will output name, whatever is passed into name. So let's go ahead and, oh wait, let's run this program. I'm going to show you that there's going to be a problem here. When we run this program, we have a syntax error. It says, in function int main, error, goodbye message was not declared in this scope. It doesn't know what goodbye message is. So either A, we misspell something here, or B, we forgot to put in the prototype. Remember I said that a prototype is necessary when the function is defined after the function call. So here's our function call, here's our function definition. So in order for the prototype to, in order for the compiler to know what to do with goodbye message, we have to add a prototype prior to the function call. So prototypes are typically after the using namespace, and the prototype requires a return type, then the function name, and then the parameter data types. So in our prototype, we need the return type of void, and then we need our function name, and it's goodbye message, and then the data type of our parameter. Just the type. We don't need the parameter name. We just need the data type. And then one important thing to note is that there's always a semicolon after your prototype. That is different than your actual function headers. Notice our function headers do not have semicolons after them, but our prototypes do have semicolons after them. So let's see if this will compile. Voila, here's our output. We now have completed our Lab35. You should be able to go to submit mode and submit for grading to get your points. Of course, I always change the input. So in the sample test cases, you're going to be reading in different names. And hopefully your program will produce the correct output. If you have any trouble, email me your problems and I'll do my best to help you.